Welcome to the second session of our fourth seminar on security. We're in the first cluster still on the infant's world, and today we have a very special presenter, our own Hannah Zeavin, the editor of Parapraxis magazine and co-founder of the Psychosocial Foundation. I am going to introduce Hannah in a second, who you all know, but still there's lots to say. But I want to first announce that issue 3 of the magazine, which is on the Wish, is now available for order. We have copies. I actually meant to show you my hard copy. It's very beautiful. Hannah's gonna go get hers. And also we will be uploading sessions to YouTube, and you can subscribe to the channel so that you'll get updated if you miss a session and it goes to YouTube, you'll be able to watch it. So Hannah will be presenting on holding, containing, and the Cold War, two texts, one by Winnicott, one by Bion. And I will introduce Hannah. Hannah Zeavin is a scholar, writer, and editor. She's an assistant professor of history in the Department of History at UC Berkeley. Her first book, The Distance Cure: A History of Teletherapy, is out from MIT Press. It's fantastic. It comes with a foreword by John Durham Peters. And her next book, Mother Media, Technology and the American Family, is expected in 2025, also from MIT Press. She's simultaneously at work on her third book, All Freud's Children, A Story of Inheritance, about the role of children in psychoanalytic theory and practice, due out from Penguin Press in the US and Fern Press in the UK. In 2021, Zeavin co-founded the Psychosocial Foundation and is the founding editor of Parapraxis, a new magazine for psychoanalysis. Other essays and criticism have appeared in Book Forum, Dissent, The Guardian, Harper's Magazine, N+1, the New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, and elsewhere. I will put links in the chat to many of those, or not, but I will. And now, Hannah Zeavin.
Hi, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, everyone. And I'm really excited to be here and to be sandwiched between Fakhri's presentation last week, which I'll try and be in conversation with, and I'm also going to try and anticipate some of where we're going next week with Bowlby, of course, because our presenter next week is someone who's here, and to whom I'm very indebted intellectually and as a historian. So that's exciting. I sort of feel like it's like making an exquisite corpse, like that form of poetry between the presentations to get at something about security. So just to say, today what we're going to do is very much return to where we left off last week with Melanie Klein, via two really different extensions of Klein's story, as Fakhri Davids put it. I really like that as a way of conceiving of Klein's infant. And so these two new stories were developed by two of her followers. I think we can say D.W. Winnicott on the one hand and Wilfred Bion on the other. And so I'm just going to set this up a bit biographically. It's partially how I think. Winnicott is a bit younger than Klein. And so is Bion, although all three are almost contemporaries. They're all born in the same decade of the 1880s. Bion and Winnicott are both working in the British context. Bion is British, and at the start of World War II is intimately at work with people like Susan Isaacs, another psychoanalyst senior to him, on something called Operation Pied Piper, which is about the evacuation of children from London to the countryside. I'm going to return to that at the very end. So he's very much thinking in the paradigm of how can we secure the psychical health of children in the face of adversity. And this dominates questions of psychoanalytic development schemas in the war and in the post-war period. So right across town at Hampstead, we have Anna Freud working on, quote unquote, in the best interest of the child at the Hampstead War Nurseries. We have various examples like this in the US. Renee Spitz comes to the US and is working on questions of predicting infant-child outcomes. We'll hear about Bowlby, obviously, next week, who is also a predictive thinker with his attachment theory. So that's the terrain we've been in and we're going to stay in. Winnicott is going to critique Freud in this paper by saying that Freud didn't have a real child in mind. And that's part of what Winnicott wants to offer, like Klein. That I would argue that Freud did have real children in mind, and we can talk about that if you like. But that's where Winnicott sort of begins. He's extending Klein, and he's rebutting kind of Freud's error there in a footnote. One more thing about D.W. Winnicott is that he starts out as a Kleinian, and then during World War II, there's something called the controversial discussions that happens in 1939 after Sigmund Freud's death, and for many years, where on the one hand, Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, asserts that she is the one true heir to Freud, yes, by blood, but also by theory. And then on the other hand, Melanie Klein asserts basically, screw your blood, I am the true inheritor of Freud. And this is very flattening and basic, but basically these two groups go at it intellectually and otherwise for a number of years. The society splits into these two camps. Winnicott is initially in the Klein camp, and then in fact a third group emerges as a kind of mediating body called the independent group or the middle group. It is like the middle child of psychoanalysis in the UK. It is the peacemaker. It is supposed to be pulled between the elder and younger siblings. And Winnicott is really kind of like the head honcho of that. And that formulation is flattening, as I said, but it should suffice for our purposes. Bion, on the other hand, who we'll get to in the second half of this presentation, is Klein's patient. He has an analysis with Klein and is absolutely her inheritor, but he's also his own theorist in every way. So with Winnicott, we'll see that we're really going to kind of get a continuation of the infant story from last week. It's a refinement. It's very much to think about the early physiological and psychological processes, which for Winnicott are never distinct in early life. And he's very careful about that. But for Bion, which the thing we read for today, very much starts with the infant and container contained, but moves very quickly and jumps 2 levels. First is to the analyst-analysand dyad. Winnicott too is gesturing towards the use clinically of this material, but then it scales to the group. Okay, with those 5 minutes of framing, I'm going to now proceed in 4 parts. And I'll keep an eye on the time. I want to talk briefly about the holding paper, and then I want to offer some historical critique of the holding paper, and then I'll turn to container contained and do the same to it a little bit. I want to say one thing before I get going further or get going again. And if you know me, I always say this, I'm very careful to say this, I am not a clinician. I don't see patients. I don't treat patients. I treat the history of people treating patients and also the intellectual history of this theory. So what I want to suggest is there are many, many, many clinicians on this call. We don't, when we get to the Q&A, have to direct questions to me. We can talk all together about this material, or you can direct questions to me. I'm fine with that too. And you can totally use the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it, and you can totally interrupt me, especially at each of these 4 different parts. I'll definitely pause. So my focus today, as Wendy sort of gestured at with this Cold War title, will be to focus on what it means to think about processes that we are told begin as an infant mother dyad, but then move all the way up to the geopolitical and ask, what does that scale do for us, if anything? It might not do anything. It might not be possible. This is the Freud-Marx problem, right? But if anything, that's where we're going. And I want to look very closely at the way these things are offered to us, and then in the clinic and in the mother-infant dyad, but then I want to get to the scale question. Okay, so also if you want to pull up, I feel like a little bit strange to be back on Zoom teaching. But if you want to pull up the essay, the Winnicott essay, feel free to read along with me. So let's begin again with D.W. Winnicott in his paper, The Theory of Parent-Infant Relationships. So as he says, he's going to bring about a comparison of the study of infancy with the study of psychoanalytic transference. So he's thinking immediately both about the infant and its mother, and then the patient and their analyst to begin. But he's really going to stay mostly with this kind of developmental schema that really refines, you know, both what Freud is gesturing to literally in a footnote, but also, as I said, Klein's schema. And for him, he begins with the idea of dependence. And he really is trying to add this feeling tone of total dependence to Klein's account. He writes, so Klein is adding many other things before Winnicott, but Winnicott really wants to draw out this element. He writes, human infants cannot start to be except under certain conditions. And for Winnicott, those certain conditions, or that certain condition, is as follows. It's inherited potential, which is individualistic, right? It's what we're born with. The second we are born, it's there. Nothing can mutate it, right? It itself, the being gets mutated, but inherited potential is its own thing. And then it meets with maternal care. So you can have all the inherited potential in the world and no maternal care, and you do not get to be for Winnicott. You don't become. And this is where, and I gestured to this briefly last week in the very introduction, this is Winnicott's ontological being. So inherited potential includes a tendency towards growth and development, says Winnicott. But again, that cannot happen without maternal care. So we know, right, maybe those of us who know something about pediatrics or have had children, we know there's this horrifying diagnosis of failure to thrive, right? And that's a physical diagnosis from pediatric medicine. The baby is not gaining weight. The baby might be quote unquote floppy, which is a really disturbing word. And for Winnicott, sure, but this is also a psychical diagnosis for Winnicott, because for Winnicott, the physiological and the psychical are absolutely joint, right? He stresses this again and again. We're not going to distinguish between the physiological process and the psychological process. And we'll see that in words like holding. Holding both means literally to hold the baby, but also this kind of gesture of holding, the psychical interrelated notion of holding. So Winnicott has told us that there will be inherited potential. It will meet maternal care, and thus we will be being. Every single infant who is being has satisfied these two conditions. And then, of course, there are many more conditions we'll come to, but those are the first two. He gets more fine-grained, he says, because of the complexities of the subject. Quote, such a statement must be made on the assumption of satisfactory maternal care, which means parental care. And just so you know, I'm going, every time there's a quote, I'm going in order. We'll move completely chronologically through the paper. So for Winnicott, like Klein, we can hear the gesture, and Fauchery is really good on this point. For Klein, mother doesn't have to be a mother. Well, Fauchery is very sure of that. But traditionally, in Klein's moment and in her society, it is a mother, so she calls it a mother. With Winnicott, he's trying to do the same move here, and I'm going to trouble this because of where I'm going. Maternal care, which means parental care, but it actually does mean a mother for Winnicott. He really can't get away from mom, so I want to flag that up. Because what he means by parental care is that eventually dad will come in. And for him, dad does mean dad. So I also want to just mark again this word satisfactory in that moment, where we have to begin to ask ourselves, under what circumstances do we get the notion of satisfactory care? Who can be satisfactory? When and where? Because this is a prescriptive theory. Absolutely. So for Winnicott, there are three kinds of this parental care. Again, they're sequential. And this is also where we're going to see that mothering is inextricable from this theory, like capital M mothering. He can't really get away from it. Here's the 3 overlapping stages. A, holding. B, mother and infant living together, where the father's function is not known to the infant. And what Winnicott means by that is that apparently father is there supporting mother. So, you know, bringing her water because of chest feeding or whatever, like there is a father there, but the baby doesn't know. And then C, mother, father, and infant, all 3 living together, end quote. So we're going to see that these stages start with holding, and then we move towards what Winnicott will call in other papers, the mother-baby phenomenon. And then eventually also Winnicott does have ideas about what it means for dad to come in. He has a radio broadcast called When Dad Comes In. And the answer is like, eventually he does, but it's not really important for Winnicott. We could basically say that dad is like a de-Oedipalizing force eventually, and that's kind of it. Dad is really underfeatured. Wendy, I might ask you to drop a link to a book called The Maternalists into the chat, and also a book by Michal Shapira called The War Inside. So if the kind of history of how these things get mobilized is of interest, especially at like the social state level, these 2 books, I think, are really, really good on these subjects. Okay, like why mothers and why is it possible in World War II? And what does it mean for the UK socially? So to just back up, Winnicott is going to continue, and he's dancing around for this whole paper for a really long time about this term holding. He says it's the aim of the paper is to talk about holding, but there's so much preparatory work we have to do before we get the payoff of holding. But he'll say that the term holding is used to denote, again, not just the actual physiological act of holding the infant, so much so that one's wrists start to hurt, but also the total environment provision prior to the concept of living with. Okay, so Winnicott is trying to tell us that he's going to use some colloquial terms. We all might say holding, or we might all say living with. I live with you, you live with me. But for Winnicott, these also have their own particular meanings. I do believe that this is one reason why people tend to love Winnicott and think of him as really friendly. And I'm going to, throughout this, talk a little bit about people's love for Winnicott, because Winnicott's theories are often understood to be proto-feminist, very forgiving of mothers and their imperfections. And of course, that's not at all the case in this paper, right? It's really not. If you read this paper, to my mind, every time, it's actually a very prescriptive paper, which I'll get to at the very end. Okay, so because Winnicott is using terms that are coincidental to the physical, holding, dropping, and also that are used colloquially, they're immediately apprehended. And in part, this is part of his, you know, he had an incredibly popular radio broadcast for 20 plus years in the UK on the BBC, starting in the war and continuing long after. But at the same time, I think this can get in the way of really hearing Winnicott's contribution to the theory, because we sort of know, we think we know what he's talking about. And these words have coincidental meaning to us. So for better or for worse. So let's really think about what he means by holding and what he means by living with. These phrases we might use all the time. He writes, quote, "In other words, it refers to a 3-dimensional or space relationship with time gradually added. This overlaps with what is initiated prior to instinctual experiences that in time will determine object relations, including the management of experiences that are inherent in existence, such as the completion and therefore the non-completion of processes," end quote. So again, he's going to stress processes, which from the outside might seem purely physiological, but which belong to the baby. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to look at the chat. And we will be putting up the Bowlby article immediately after this. I saw that in the chat. Okay. So one other part of this is that the infant's psychology is going to take place in this complex psychological field, Winnicott says, and it's going to be determined by the awareness and empathy of the mother. So that's what living with is. and the state of, that there is these object relations, and the emergence of them can only come after the state of being has come, right? After inherited potential has met maternal care, right? So these things all build, and we're building to the baby's capacity to distinguish me and not me. These are all Winnicottian ideas. They've all been fleshed out in other papers, right? By the time we get this paper, a bit like Klein, where she just like straight up dumps her earlier work into her new work. There's a lot of kind of previous writing of Winnicott's and more to come on each of these ideas. But these stages of development, they're very compatible with Klein's vision. And yet he's really just tarrying on this earliest stage, this holding idea. And even though he stresses that this is all artificial, at the same time, it really matters to him. And it has to do, again, like Klein, like Lacan's mirror stage. These are competing theories. They're not coincidental, but there's all the same moment. It's the same infant in all of those cases. Where the organization of the body of the infant is happening, and the infant is becoming a person, is in the process of becoming a person, that in the end, there's a kind of healthy, normative, prescriptive moment in all three of those papers, in all kind of infant development papers. And as Fakhri said last week, again, they're just stories of development. So before we really get at Winnicott's idea of holding, we have to think about what's happening for the infant in that moment of holding. And again, it's a cyclical thing. I'm sorry to keep stressing it, but you hear holding and you just think, I'm holding my iced coffee. It's also the cyclical thing that's not merely enough to just hold the baby, right? But you have to do it in this particular way, that he's going to join under the sign of what he's going to call good enough mothering. But it's also that he's very exacting about good enough mothering. The mother has to do stuff correctly. And otherwise, the holding phase gets messed up and everything else is going to get messed up. We'll see this also with Bowlby next week. There's a kind of sequence and there's a kind of prediction. And if one domino doesn't fall, something not good happens. So the infant is maximally dependent on having the mother do this work. And again, he's going to give us 3 stages of dependence: dependence absolute, dependence relative, and towards independence. And I'm going to try and return to this because, I really think that independence is a fantasy. And independence means something for Winnicott that's critical, that I want to kind of reject. I want to critique. But we're really getting to that idea of holding, I promise. Winnicott wants to explain what is happening to the baby in this early stage when the parent-infant relationship is starting to happen, and it's this annihilation anxiety. It's the existential fear where it is the, quote, essential existence of a holding environment where the inherited potential is becoming itself a continuity of being. Alternative to being for Winnicott, quote, is reacting, and reacting trumps being and annihilates, end quote. So for Winnicott, it is that being and annihilation are 2 alternatives, right, for him. And the holding environment, which is the entire setup, it's a phrase Winnicott loves to use, not just the mother, but the entire setup, therefore has its main function to reduce the minimum of impingement, he writes, to which the infant must react with resultant annihilation of personal being. And there are impingements on babies all the time, right? These are the things Fakhri was dramatizing last week, of the gas, or right, all of these things are happening inside the baby and outside the baby. The baby is suddenly cold, etc. And for Winnicott, the stakes are really high. This is, again, part of the contradiction between what Winnicott advanced on the radio and how he was taken up in the culture and what he's writing in his clinical papers. He writes that under favorable conditions, the infant is going to establish a continuity of existence and then begin to develop the sophistications with which it is possible for impingements to be gathered into the area of omnipotence. He continues, the word death has no possible application for us. The baby must know it's separate from the mother so that it can hate the mother, and then the infant can think about death. I really do love this sentence. The word death has no possible application for us. Were it to be so, right? It's an amazing moment. And we apparently all came from that moment. So once the baby can think about destructiveness, that's Klein's aggression, right? And in fact, then for Winnicott and for Klein, you can maim the mother, you don't have to kill the mother, but that's all coming later. Again, Winnicott's doing this really interesting delay tactic, this entire paper. He's like, I'm not talking about later, I'm talking about later. And then we get to section B, the maternal care section. I'm not going to deal with the organizing principle of Freud's footnote too much. I don't think we have to get what we need from this paper by fretting it. But Winnicott will talk, quote, about the actual state of the infant-mother relationship at the beginning, when the infant has not separated out from the maternal. Absolute dependence is ruling the day, and at this stage we have holding, we have the mother presaging the infant's needs, right? That the mother is, she's magical. And eventually, when that's not wanted anymore, she's a witch, right? These are Winnicott's words. Can't win. So absolute dependence is ruling the day. It's holding time. And then Winnicott's going to say that there are going to be two environmental provisions. One, right? Holding is going to have two characteristics. One, it will meet physiological needs. So you don't literally drop the baby, right? You do literally hold the baby. But two, it's reliable. Okay. But Winnicott says immediately that it must be reliable, but not mechanical. So it has to be reliable in a way that implies the mother's spirit is behind it, right? Mom is there and she is with you. It's not rote, it's not mechanical. And this is what he calls maternal empathy. So the example I was taught, I have a 4-year-old 5 years ago almost, or whatever, when I gave birth, he's almost 5. When I had my baby, I was taught the idea that, you know, you can't be bored when you change a diaper. And it doesn't matter as the mother how many diapers you're going to change in a day. And I believe it's like roughly 8 at that point. You can never be bored, right? You have to be alert. The baby is not bored. You cannot be bored, right? You must be related to the baby and related to the task of managing each element of baby's environment. And the baby itself and these elements are taken together as holding, which again is to protect the baby, to give the baby security, first and foremost in this physiological, psychological back and forth. And for Winnicott, it's not nothing, right? His prescription, what he's going to demand of mother, is pretty intense. It's taking onto consideration and taking on board all of the elements that eventually a human being may come to regulate for themselves. So our skin sensations, I'm wearing a sweater right now, baby needs the sweater or not. And the mother must be attuned, right? She has to be there before baby is there. Good enough mothering requires getting to the baby before the baby cries in this stage, right? It's this presaging. We'll talk about what happens next, but right, our skin sensations, our textures, how hot and cool we are, what's happening in the auditory field, is that a siren? Oh no, what's happening in our visual fields? And then also, and I think this is so key, and it's strange to me that Winnicott goes past it so quickly, gravity, right? So the opposite of holding is dropping for Winnicott. And again, being dropped psychologically is just as bad, maybe, as the idea of being dropped physically, but infants are under threat to being dropped all the time. Not in real, but in their bodies nonetheless, right? We're born with a reflex. All infants are born with a reflex where they believe that they're being dropped all the time. Their arms shoot out, right? I don't know if any of you have had children. It's a very strange thing, right? You know, that's why parents are often told to swaddle infants so they don't wake themselves up with this reflex, right? And so Winnicott's responding to that that's part of, you know, the physiology that babies are born with. So Winnicott's thinking about all of this particular sensoria, but on top of that, no, also a particular infant and the individualization that infant care needs, right? It can't be the same as your first baby or your friend's baby, or the experience you're having as a mother is different from your friends. And that's all good, right? That's for Winnicott. You know, you could see a kind of feminist organic solidarity emerging there, but you have to be able to do it. And not just your baby, but the fact is that babies change. I have 3 friends right now with new babies, and each of them have been commenting on this very thing. All their babies are under 3 weeks old, which is that one's own baby is changing all the time. So the minute an infant sets a pattern, it changes that pattern. And you have to only notice a pattern because, in fact, the pattern has changed. It's the only time you can notice it. And Winnicott's very demanding that it's the mother who will be noticing all of these individual changes in the individual baby. So it's a hugely individualistic theory, right, of attention. So I'm going to change registers in a second, but this is where we have this idea of trust yourself. You know more than you think. That's from Dr. Spock in 1946. Or when Winnicott tells you, all you have to do is be a good enough mother. Neither of those things has ever sat well with me as a historian. For me, it opens on to some of the trickiness about Winnicott, right? And we see it at the end of this paper. Winnicott again, quote, "It should be noted that mothers who have it in them to provide good enough care can be able to do better by being cared for themselves in a way that acknowledges the essential nature of their task. Mothers who do not have it in them to provide good enough care cannot be made good enough by mere instruction," end quote. So Winnicott is, in his friendly way, talking about maternal fitness and nicer terms for who is a fit mother and who is not, but nonetheless, that's what they are. And these are always ideological constructs as well as psychological constructs. They don't proceed without the other, much like for Winnicott, the physiological and the psychological cannot proceed separately. And at last we get to holding. So for Winnicott, holding, again, is going to include this physical holding as a form, but it's also a form of love or a kind of tenderness. It's about touching. It's about providing the baby's security, a psychological security, a psychical security, because again, it's this mother who can calm the baby, who knows how to hold the baby, who knows how to make the baby secure. That's the good mother. And it's the mother who cannot calm her baby, where the baby is insecure, who is not a good mother. And again, Winnicott's going to stress here once more that you cannot teach mothering. So we've heard that we all have inherited potential as a baby. Here quietly, we hear that we haven't inherited potential as mothers. And that's it, right? In the past, it has already met its own mothering. And this is the theory of how to be a good enough mother. So we have this idea that you're either a mother, a good one, or a good enough one, or you're not. And this is absolutely normal for Winnicott in his theory, but also in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? Where we have the kind of psychological question of how to think about good enough parenting and how it scales. And the scaling is there. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to just stop there and see if anyone wants to talk about Winnicott himself. And then I'll give my little historical further critique. If there are any questions or I talk really quickly, which I know, and you want me to slow down.
Hannah, I'm a clinician and one of those people who love Winnicott, so I'm just taking it in. I'm taking it in.
Wait, see you.
Hmm?
I can't. Who is speaking?
Sorry, David. I don't know if I'm on camera or not.
Oh yeah, I'll change the view so I can go ahead, David.
So I was just wondering, like, how you think is at least how I've thought about Winnicott is he has a lot of space for like aggression, hate, and for the therapist to have a lot of room with our feelings. And so I'm wondering, like, if what you think of that in light of your, like, does it fit with your critique as you're discussing? I know you're going to go into it more, it sounds like, or, you know, in terms of sort of this exacting idea of being a mother and, you know, sort of linked to ideology, as you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, Winnicott is many things as a thinker, and also any of these clinicians, how they're taken up afterwards and in the consulting room is very different from what they lay down and what they write. These are different acts. Like I'm obsessed with Juliet Mitchell. We quote it all the time between us at Parapraxis saying, you know, Freud, an amazing writer, terrible clinician, and Klein, amazing clinician and not the best writer, right? These things. What I'm interested in is the sort of social reception of Winnicott over time as being this great proto-feminist, especially because of where I'm going, which is that, you know, his theory wasn't just used clinically by himself. I mean, I can't comment on him as a clinician. I wasn't in the room, but we have this, you know, at the end of the day, I wasn't the pickle, I think, as far as I know, his most famous child patient. I think there is. I mean, aggression's right there in the theory. And nonetheless, there's like sort of, there's not the room for the mother where there is for the analyst. And that's a kind of interesting trick here, because Winnicott is trying to show how the theory will function for the analyst, but mothering has already taken place in the past by the time the patient shows up in this part of mothering. Winnicott's not seeing 4-month-olds, right? So it's always a kind of speculative past that he's trying to get at. So I don't think it has to hurt or get at, get in the way of your particular love for Winnicott and his theory. But what he is demanding to mothers, and again, it's not so abstract. He's demanding it of mothers on the right. I mean, he is the voice of maternality. Much like in the US, we had Spock for a good 20 plus years. And that's really where my beef with him lies. Well, that and stuff about Marianne Milner, but that's for another time. I don't know if that helps. Suzanne, I'm not, but we can talk about it all together. Absolutely. Again, I'm not a clinician. That's not how I read. I mean, I am a patient and I'm a believer in psychoanalysis, but it's not how I read this work.
Hannah, I was just wondering if you could connect what you were saying to something that Fakhri was saying last week, where the way I understood Fakhri's talk was that there was also a kind of black and white, which gets mapped onto the mother, where it's very difficult to imagine an actual good enough mother. But part of how he presented that is that that's kind of indexed to the baby's kind of fantasy of the mother, where what's kind of objective about it is either you're fed enough or you're not, or you're warm enough or you're not. And so I felt that his talk had some of that same, like, in a way, kind of harshness, like how could anyone produce that outcome? But it was linked, the thing that felt black and white was less the idea of the mother and more the infant's perspective. And I was wondering if in your reading of Winnicott, there's that same grounding in the infant's perspective, because your perspective, which I very much agree with in a lot of ways, and I also don't particularly like Winnicott instinctively, but seems to be more about an idea of the mother, whereas Fakhri had us more in a set of like sensations that were kind of objective. And so I wonder if that makes sense, and if you want to if you could play out a little bit how you relate to that part of what Fakhri had to say.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I know that that's Nika by voice. Am I right? Is my knowing correct? I can't see anyone.
Sorry, it's Nika.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for your question. It's a great question. Yeah. So Fakhri, right, when he's teaching Klein, he says Klein is trying to be inside the infant's perspective. I don't think that's what Winnicott is doing. I think this is actually an observational stance, right? That this is, and it, it's not the infant who's like, you must attend to my gravity and my oral field and my visual field. Right. Klein is proceeding from a much more kind of rudimentary, that's why black and white, split, etc. I think that, oh, Giovanna, that's a really interesting question. I have no idea. I mean, Winnicott did work with a lot of Anglicans, but not Calvinists. But that's very interesting. Is Winnicott a theory of predestination? Yeah, and double predetermination. But Nika, just to finish, that's not how I read Winnicott. I read him as doing observational work, right? That's what's being evinced here. And then he is trying to think about these concepts and how they'll work in the consulting room. Totally. So if you had a different person come to talk to you about what it is to do holding in the consulting room, that would be a place the paper wants to go as well. But I'm interested in how it gets domesticated, right? This is not a paper that only clinicians read. In fact, it had a whole life in actual mothering as it was taken up. Yeah. And I want to hear, of course, Nika, why you don't like Winnicott. I put in the chat, poor Winnicott. I didn't mean to start a pile on, but also fascinated because he tends to be everyone's favorite, right? People hate Klein. They have lots of nasty stuff to say about Freud, Lacan also, but Winnicott seems to get the pass. And I'm interested in that phenomenon.
We can talk offline, but thank
you. Yeah.
Hannah, there's also a comment from Jasmine Gilbert. I don't know if you saw that in the chat.
Yeah, the comment is, with the mother being good enough or providing containment for baby, and then father providing environmental stabilization resources, doesn't that kind of posit the father as the ontological mother of sorts? That's interesting. I'd have to really sit and think with that, Jasmine. I do want to say that being a good enough mother and containment are not at all the same thing as far as I read them. So I'm going to try and disambiguate those two things. Is the father then the ontological mother of the mother too, right? What is father's role? That's really interesting. I have to think about it. I will say this, that part of why fathers drop out of work here is that, and this is Winnicott's beef with Freud, and it's a good one, is, Freud all of a sudden comes to the importance of the mother quite late. And the theory is suddenly like, oh, we have to contend with female sexuality, we have to contend with mothering, we have to contend with pre-Oedipality, which is added after the Oedipus complex, just in terms of chronological intellectual development of the theory. By World War II, this is not possible. Many dads, not all dads, but are away. They're at the front, they're not home. And a lot of research is happening in all of these different places. We'll hear about some of it next week, I hope, from our next speaker, who wrote an amazing book about this. But, there are experiments with monkeys, with ducks. What is the function of the mother? Can you survive without a mother? Will the wired monkey mother be enough? And the resolute answer is no. So there is this kind of maternalism, and Wendy put the link in the chat to that book, that takes over, starting in the second generation of psychoanalysts, many of whom are women as well. So that it's a kind of overdetermined moment where we sort of jettison the importance of father. And so even colloquially, and I get this a lot, people think Freud is all about, tell me about your mommy. And like, resolutely no, Freud was not so interested in the mother, but we see the opposite, the kind of overcompensation take place. I love this question though, Jasmine, and I'm going to want to think about it. And Soren also has an amazing question in the chat here, which is, with the concept of good enough mother, is there the corollary concept of the good enough child? And Soren, I think, and then maybe we can move on just for the sake of time. Soren, one of the things that I'm going to get to next is that, in fact, children are put into this kind of good-bad split reality around delinquency. So there's this kind of predictive theory. Winnicott's talking about it at the end. You get a good mom, good enough mom, you have innate potential, you meet maternal care, you're going to be okay. But if you don't, you're not going to be neurotic, you're going to be psychotic. That is part of how Winnicott was actively working, like he himself, not just the theory. Although, and that's again a history of the clinic. It's just not, I think, what David wanted me to talk about, which would be maybe the individual and contemporary clinic. Okay, we're never going to get to Bion. So let me just be really brief. Let me think about how to be really brief about this. I mean, and in some ways it came out in the Q&A, so maybe I can just underscore. One thing that Winnicott is doing here is setting this up that it all redounds to mother. Father comes in at the end, yes, but also he is very much, on the one hand, radical for his moment. We have to give this up to Winnicott, because he eventually introduces, right, not just baby's dependency on its mother, but the notion that the baby mediates the mother too. There is no such thing as a baby, Winnicott says. There's only mother, baby. And in this way, he also says there's no such thing as a mother, right? That this is a kind of assemblage. He sounds like someone who's just taken their first science and technology studies class, right? We are not separated from our socio-technical assemblages, Winnicott is trying to say. And he's really in conversation with this recently consolidated field of child psychoanalysis that had stunningly taken shape in the preceding decades, but also in nascent pediatric psychiatry, where in general, mother was understood to have a near total influence on child and infant outcomes in the rest of psychology. So this is true for John Watson, right, who has nothing to do with psychoanalysis. And like all work centered on pathology, we could say that the outcomes that were addressed, and this is to Soren's point, were largely the bad ones elsewhere, right? So Winnicott's leading with this really normative case, but throughout the essay, we have this constant threat of what will happen if any part of this goes wrong. And it's actually, the reason I went through all of the conditions is it's actually a really complicated puzzle. And one thing that we're not told throughout the article is, where's the room for error, right? Like what happens if mother doesn't presage like one day? What if mom has an off day, right? We're just sort of told that this is how this kind of holding is supposed to function. But one thing I also want to draw out is this idea that Winnicott is doing this idea of mother baby and not carer baby. And I don't think it's an accident. Fathers are rarely going to appear in Winnicott and other maternalist work of this period, as I've stressed. But Winnicott's also addressing a UK context wherein a drastic decrease in removal of wage domestic workers had already taken place in the interwar period, including wage childminders. And although as the work of psychoanalysis too often, Winnicott is going to go on to treat this as a generic phenomenon, one existing outside of time and society. This is just how babies are, he says. This is just how moms are. He's nonetheless reacting to massive social change. So no longer is it acceptable to have a proxy mother inside the theory, in part because there are very few proxy mothers outside of the theory for Winnicott. So for baby to exist, baby would have to be a priori for Winnicott with the mother. But in describing this British mother baby, and again, the formulation was championed by clinicians and some feminists on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond, and it provides this new name for this longstanding conception of holding the environment, mother baby, all of these different ways of phrasing the interlinked bond between mother and child. Winnicott is again writing in an era in which there's a mandate for mother to be environment, Winnicott's term, because she is largely assumed to have produced the infant's reality, material reality, through her body. This will start to change in the Cold War, the base assumption around the mother, but it's not so yet when Winnicott's writing. So to provide this theory, right, I want to just say it requires training eyes away from the uniquity of value on family forms. Single parent households, multi-generational households, and it involved ignoring immigrant patterns of family making that were happening around him. It included ignoring Black families in order to elevate and naturalize the mother baby. And it also naturalizes the family wage that's starting to emerge in the UK context, right? This idea that dad is gathering resources from Jasmine's question. I'm like, is the British state the ontological mother rather than the British father? Just thinking about Jasmine's amazing question. And it meant to suggest that there's something innate instinctual about mothering, right? Where we see this real shift away in the preceding decades of scientific mothering, where you totally could be taught how to mother, right? There were clinics where you could bring your baby and yourself to learn how to mother, multiple every week weigh-ins for baby. I'm not suggesting this is good either. Highly surveillant theories of mothering. And there were lots of books about mothering, to now libidinal mothering, or compassionate mothering, as it's called in the United States, where you are supposed to know instinctively through femininity, right, that you are the right medium of care. So for Winnicott, mother is fungible, right, a set of activities and objects, including her labor and herself, but she's never fungible enough so as to be interchangeable with another person. So that's really one of the critiques. I'm going to turn to Bion. The other critique I wanted to bring out, but let's maybe bring it to Bowlby next week, has to do again with the fact that these are theories of security. So Winnicott's, but also Bowlby's, Renee Spitz, as I said, they're all about the fantasy of predicting the undesirable outcome, both by diagnosing mother, and once mother has had the baby, that baby too gets diagnosed immediately. So it's a highly pathologizing theory. It is at its base about maternal fitness and unfitness, and it is at its base about child delinquency. So if, as I said, and I flagged it up, independence is a fantasy and satisfactory care is too, if one fails to achieve it correctly, one is actually never going to be independent again by Winnicott's theory, right? One is going to be hived off as delinquent. And I mean this quite literally. All of these theories were used. Some of them are still used in the case of Bowlby and Spitz. And I write about this in my second book called Mother Media. They're used by carceral systems predictively still to this day, algorithmically. So these theories of security that are about achieving independence through security of attachment, as we'll hear about next week, or here security against annihilation anxiety, are in fact predictive and they are prescriptive. So again, I kept thinking about this morning. I was talking to Air, who's here in the Zoom room and not here anymore at my apartment, right? That when we think about holding and we think about how if one is dropped, one gets held later by the state, that actually holding has this insidious other echo for me when I read Winnicott, that there's this decision tree advanced in essence by these theories and not again in the abstract, where Winnicott worked with juvenile delinquents, as did Bowlby, as did many of these people. And then their theories were used to continue to substantiate the category of the juvenile delinquent, all redounding to mother, all redounding to the earliest scene of holding, so that later they would be held in captivity, right? Like in jail. Okay, I'm going to turn to Bion now. I also want to say something else that Eric reminded me of, though, which is that Winnicott, this will be the last thing I say about Winnicott until you ask me to say more. Winnicott thought an otherwise successful analysis, right, was incomplete because the patient remained a communist. And I merely say this to seed where I'm going with Bion, about how these theories of delinquency are situated in the Cold War era politically. Okay, container contained. I timed this morning. It was half this length. I apologize. I'll be really brief. I guess I'll spend less time on Bion, both because of time, but also because this paper is really difficult. And I just want to draw out what I think is important for thinking about security, rather than when we do our seminar on groups, you know what I mean, or on mysticism, or on or on genius. Bion gives us so much in this paper. So if Winnicott provides us with this story that's additive largely to Klein's story, Bion, who also comes after Klein, is offering a different theory. He's offering a theory of intrapsychic action, of container and contained, that he scales. And he scales it, ooh, balloons just went off in Lindsay's Zoom. It was amazing. Balloons for Bion. And he's going to scale it, right? And he scales it immediately. So it starts with mother, baby, group, and then suddenly kind of the universe. And I want to back up because I think Bion is amazing. And yet this is a whole new idiom if you haven't read Bion before. And I'm going to try and think about Bion's containment broadly right at the end before we totally have me shut up and we talk about these papers. So for psychoanalysis, containment has a whole meaning unto itself, right? This is another word like holding that we use colloquially. And it was born from the head of Wilfred Bion. And it's too about mother's work. It was first described in 1962 in his book, Learning from Experience, which was published in the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I want you to hold on to that. That's where I'm going. Bion redescribes the work of a mother as a containing function. Now, this theory is also highly compatible with Klein's infant from last week. Bion is relying on Klein, really, without citing her all that much. So if we recall projective identification, right, the pouring out of the bad onto and into the other, that's the major action that starts this process. So for Bion, though, he specifies, quote, to become a psychic object, the projected element has to encounter a container or a thinking function. So for Bion, these are represented with a male and female symbol. I don't know if you noticed that. Now, the reason he states is because he's trying not to pin down a thing before we know it, like by arresting it in language. But but Bion is giving us symbols and we quote unquote know what they mean. So the container is a female symbol and the contained is a male symbol. I want to say that this is not your daddy Freud's passive and active femininity and masculinity, but this is highly sexuated, right? It's by male and female symbols. He could have chosen other symbols. Later, he is going to choose other symbols. But at this point, he's working with these male and female symbols. But again, his stated reason for doing so is having to do with not putting into words that which is not yet discoverable, which is also Bion's O, is the thing that's not yet discoverable, but is. And so again, the projected elements are male, the container is female. And again, the container is the mother. Although again, that's also immediately for Bion the analytic situation. Like we are done with infancy as fast as we began. Now we're in the analytics situation, right? And so we, the patient, we spew out all of our stuff, whatever it is, we're not going to name it. It's just going to get the male symbol. And we put it into our container, the analyst. So once more, the container's counterpart is the contained. And of course, the mother herself is not the container. And the analytic scenario Bion tells us isn't the container either. I think what he's trying to do there is to make sure we don't confuse the word frame or setting in the British context for container, because the frame and container could be synonymous. The frame being the, the setting, how many times a week you meet, at what time, at what fee, etc. The greeting. He's really trying to talk about an intrapsychic action. The analyst is going to offer the process, here's that word again, of containment, hopefully to their patient. But if we return to the mother, who from whence this comes, just like with Winnicott, she is ordering, making sense, taking up the baby's contents, right? Taking what is violent and intolerable, what must be projected outwards, remember Fakri and the baby last week, and make it tolerable, make it make a certain kind of approachable, not even sense, but put togetherness. She fails to contain when the intolerable reappears, right? We can think about Klein's infant going to bits and the mother being able to put those bits back together. So as Bion, and also why one's going to bits, which is often the hardest thing to find out and to know. So as Bion has it, quote, and I love this line, to be unable to bear an ill is itself a great ill. To be unable to bear an ill is itself a great ill. So this is not your good enough mother's holding. It's really not. It's not about presaging need. It's actually a communication structure. The mother is receiving something from the baby and giving it back to the baby. It's very different in terms of action. It's a different story. And it's not saying, as holding is sometimes misconstrued, I hear you and respect you, right? That doesn't work for this infant either, for Bion, right? Containment is deeply intrapsychic. It's demanding that we metabolize the ill of the other, their chaos, and feed the person back what they've just projected into us in a form that they can use. Okay, so this is totally, a real addition to what Klein is talking about. It's a real difference from Winnicott. So now Bion scales this immediately in what we read for today. And again, there's just so much in this paper. I love this paper. Really quickly, when would you put, because everyone should then quit the Zoom and go watch this instead. We had Fred Moden come talk about this Bion paper in part, because he writes off of it and with it in his own work, and it's an amazing video. But before Bion turned to thinking about container and contained, right, he was a thinker of groups, what's often called early Bion. And so in this work and afterwards in the 1970s, he began to braid his work on the dyad and container and contained with his work on the mass in the group. And he was particularly interested, and we see this in the paper for today, in malfunctioning. When groups are functionally containing bidirectionally between the mass and their leader, or the mystic, or the genius in Bion's terms, both quote unquote hostility and benevolence are present. So the leader is closely watched, but the group and the leader both grow in stature. When things fall apart, so says Bion, in what he calls a parasitic association, again with the amazing phrase, quote, even friendliness is deadly. So this is an intense picture for Bion of group functioning. For Bion, there are 3 types of containment, and that's where I'll end with this paper, just again for the sake of time. See, I talked about the thing I like less way longer than the thing I love. It's too bad for me. For Bion, there are 3 types of containment. One might be called good or symbiotic. This is as close as we're going to get to similarity between Winnicott's good enough mother and Bion's container contained, a symbiotic containment. But this is this is a place where Bion and Winnicott share. It's the symbiotic containment is which a relationship continues to change and to grow, right? So if you think about Winnicott's baby, where the mother knows that baby is going to change and that baby is allowed to change and the mother changes in response to its change, So symbiotic containment is a changing and growing of container contained. This is also true in the good analytic sense for Bion. This is true also between an analyst and an analysand. It's also true for Bion between an institution and a constituent. Then there's commensal containment, which is static or neutral or fine. Bion doesn't really give a shit about that. He's very interested in the good and bad, right? And then lastly, the third type is parasitic. It's disastrous. It, quote, destroys both parties to the association, end quote. And finally, quote, destroys host and parasite alike, end quote. So the inability to contain, when it becomes devastating, is itself a form of containment for Bion. And I think that's really important to say. A wretched, extracted, envious swallowing of the other. That's also a containment. It's just not a very nice one, right? And we can really hear him be a Kleinian here, because for him with this, like all envy, the aim of that envy is the destruction of what the other has. And so you can do this as an action in containment. Okay, I'll pause there really briefly, and then I have like just 2 seconds of what I want to point out about containment contained in the Cold War.
Anyone have questions at this stage?
There's so much happening in this paper. So much. There's a mystic. I mean, there's so much. There's stuff about Jesus. I actually think I want someone to put together all the times psychoanalysts deal with Jesus. Wilhelm Reich's book on Jesus with Bion's work on Jesus. I think it'd be really interesting.
I have a question about the political backdrop of all of this, but I wonder if maybe you should talk about the Cold War context a little bit first before I ask my question.
Sure. I'll just do that now, because then we can have like totally open conversation about anything without me framing it up. Okay. So I find it interesting that it's never remarked upon that Bion, again, who I love, and not that that matters, but is writing container contained at the height of the Cold War. He publishes his first mention of it after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in the same year. So in 1947, George F. Cannon, quite famously, but this is for all of you who have happily been able to repress your US history, which I'm not allowed to do. But in 1947, George F. Cannon formulated the strategy by which the United States would attempt to fight communism, right? And especially control its spread. And the plan was very simple. It merely required, quote, an adroit and vigilant application of counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points corresponding to the specifics and maneuvers of Soviet policy, end quote. So already we hear. One, in order to contain, one has to be responsive to what's coming at one and give it back in the form that the other can use. This is 1947. At first, this was called the X article. While others proposed to turn the US away from the world and practice isolationism, or on the other direction, all-out rollback. These are all the terms of art from military strategy in the name of quote-unquote liberation, i.e. a hot war, and it would become one. X article offered a different approach. Cannon thought foreign policy should be an admixture of targeted geographical blockage, economic spending, and all-out psychological warfare. It was very, very important. And eventually X article became known as the containment policy. Now, Cannon's containment policy always had the mind in mind. And we're going to see this too next week with Bowlby, and we see it already today and also last week. But it had its own tagline, stop communism. It's everybody's job. So it was the job of the military, like most obviously. It was also the job of the industrial complex to do containment over there in Europe, in Asia. But there was also containment work to be done at home. And particularly like all homework, this was to be the mothers. This was understood. So domestic containment, which is what it was called at the time, meant a particularly nasty strain in the US of anti-momism escorted by the publication of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of popular books that argued that American mothers were a scourge and provided either too much or too little stimulus for their babies, and that when they did so, they in turn produced quote unquote undesirable outcomes in them. These were the outcomes they were worried about: queerness, autism, submission. There was a worry about sexuality and gender throughout, but sort of at the top of this pyramid was the communist child. And of course, you could be many of these things all at once, right? But the communist child was the fear. Many psychiatrists agreed this was something almost every American mother was bad at. Now, I know Bion's working in the UK, but there's a version of it happening there too. So now the nation depended on her securing it from within, the goodness of the child, and the fate of its good anti-communist sons. So this theory was much more interested in sons, although not only, hung in the balance. So domestic containment required mother to get it together fast and at scale. And neither freeze her child in the sense of the refrigerator mother, nor overheat their child with smothering, right? She had to, you could say, hold the child as a good enough mother and do so correctly. And the aim, just like with Winnicott, was eventually an individualized independence in the child. So we have domestic containment, we have the foreign policy of containment, and then on the table we also have Bion's containment, his dyadic containment of container and contained. So having served in World War I as a soldier and in World War II as a military psychiatrist, Wilfred Bion would have been intimately knowledgeable of the ongoing European defensive strategy to isolate both Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, where the liminal states separating France and Eastern Europe were called on to act as a buffer because he was part of it. The US containment policy of the Cold War was merely a resumption after that brief interruption known as World War II to that policy in the UK. The quote unquote diseased nations were kept at bay, and this was understood just behind a human wall, the protective good container. So that shift in coinage to containment had already flooded international parlance as Bion was beginning to work on his theory. So Bion's maternal containment, a theory of the mother making good sense of the child, of taking what is ill and giving it back in a form it can use, appears just at that moment of the good mother of the West trying to contain this sickness, and that language is used everywhere, and threat of communism, to process it, to give it in a form and a shape where it could become a bearable ill. So in our present, we have other notions of containing I want to gesture at really briefly, and two come to mind. 2 days ago, I saw an article that was talking about the containerization of the West Bank. So right, we have the foreign policy sense still by Israel, but also we hear about containment as a way of holding someone back or being able to manage them in a really insidious way. What comes to mind is when Lara Shihai was disinvited from presenting at APSA last year. The letter to membership said a session could not contain her, was used that way. And of course, it's supposed to be of Bion, but it's not. So in our present, we have these other notions of containing. I just want to add one more, which is that self-containment and other containment is highly racialized. So the notion of the containable and the uncontainable has an additional resonance, especially in the US. Another form of domestic containment. In fact, it has its own foreign policy history around the Civil War. It has its own foreign policy and domestic policy around keeping a balance of quote unquote free and slave states, that we can also trace the foreign policy of containment from the Cold War II. That's a different lineage. But also we have this notion of the object that needs to be metabolized, the pathologized ill, as often getting attached to Blackness, and also around the kind of fantasy of the hot affect, the uncontained of Black rage. So where whiteness tries to contain Blackness while demanding Blackness affect self-contain. We see this also with what happened with Shiha last year. And, I just want to draw this for one more sentence, which is in the notion of not being able to be self-contained management has to come in and manage. This is the kind of work of the group that we can also see in Bion's work. And the injunctions to quote unquote be contained and to contain that which is uncontainable constitutes a form of policing or intervening in and on life. So as Fred Moden writes, and he rewrites the container-contained dyad, says, quote, they containerize her, but she is uncontained. So in fact, saying that to be uncontained rather than to be contained is the aim, right? Kind of fugitivity. Or Toni Morrison says to be uncontained is to be uncontainable, outlawed, quote, unpolicing, right? And so that there are all these different ways of thinking the resonance, both how Bion comes to the term containment, and then its kind of notion of being the thing that solves the illness, takes the thing that's spoiled. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. This is much longer than I planned to speak. And just see what we can make of it together. You know, my question is, does this change anything for us? Right? What does it mean to think about processes in the infant mother and geopolitics at the same time? And does the scale change that Bion offers us, where he wants to scale the infant to society via the group? Does that change his scale too? Okay.
Yeah, so we can go to questions now, either in the chat or you can raise your hand. And we have some from before that were responding to the Winnicott. I think if it's okay, I just want to ask you a question that combines this historicization of the theory that you provided with Bion, but goes back to something that you mentioned about Winnicott, which is this idea of highly individualized parenting. And I was thinking about Derek Bell's theory of interest convergence during the Cold War, you know, this idea that affirmative action progressed rapidly as a way for the US to export an image of itself contra communism and the East. And also Moren's piece last night about the kind of proliferation of MFA programs as also this way for the West to kind of advance its program of creativity against communism or something like that was also playing into these ideas of a highly kind of individualized expressive voice type thing. And I guess I was wondering, within the intellectual history of psychoanalysis, if someone like, if these theories of how to raise a new generation of children that are highly individualized was gained popularity against other contemporary theories that were less about mothering in this sort of extremely particularized way, or if that kind of counter literature doesn't exist, or what might be there.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Wendy. I mean, right, this is so far. So I always try and remind myself of this, which is that psychoanalysis is not at all homogenous, right? So this is the exact same moment that Wilhelm Reich is writing about children of the future to a totally different end. But, you know, mothers were not reading Wilhelm Reich. It's just not what was happening. In fact, Wilhelm Reich's about to end up in jail and die there, thanks to the US government at this exact moment. And by the time we get to the Bion, that's already happened in the past, right? So there was this kind of foreclosure. And of course, you know, Hannah Proctor is the person to ask about this in the Soviet context, but also, right, Soviet psychoanalysis had a very different history. So I think that the question then is, what were the other theories of mothering that were available? And they were about instinctual and libidinal mothering on the one hand, and the kind of anti-momism scourge, which those theories are not necessarily psychoanalytic. Leo Kanner, for instance, who in the US coins the term and pathology around autism, and others who are working with him or against him. They were not psychoanalysts. But many of the popular texts were at least significantly indebted to a kind of psychoanalytic light persuasion. And it was the going concern for mental health care in the US, right? We were in the midst of Freud mania. That is deeply true. And it was in all of the parenting literature. One thing that's amazing about it, when you read that stuff, is it presumes this quite exquisite knowledge of psychoanalysis that the everyday lay reader was supposedly having. And we know that that's no longer the case, right? But so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that yes, it suited, it worked politically, right? It did. And of course, therefore it was allowed to exist.
Right. Right. Okay, does anyone feel free to raise your hands. We have a bunch of questions in the chat. Also one from Ryan from earlier about Afghan Ann's book.
Let me go
Ryan,
look.
do you want
Sorry.
to read that, or do you want
I
us?
just want to say that if I didn't see your question in the chat, it wasn't because I didn't like it or was ignoring it. It's just hard to do both at once. Let me scroll back up. And
Yeah,
Ryan, of course, if you want to ask, please do. Viva voce, I mean.
I'm happy to. So I wrote in the chat, in Gender Without Identity, Pellegrini and Sakatapulo talk about the always changing self, that there is not an entirely stable identity or a core identity that you were born with, especially in relation to gender. Winnicott is putting a lot of identity formation into infancy, but is what you're saying of Winnicott believing in the mother isn't good enough from their infancy care? Is he positing that infancy is the like end stage of that sort of development? Is there not a changing of identity that can happen to make you a good enough mother past that? Is that like the, I guess, container that gets put into to put it in conversation? Or is that ever flowing identity something in Winnicott, especially in terms of mothering?
Can I repeat back to you what I think you're asking? Because to make sure I'm getting it. Are you asking that? Okay, so I don't think there's exactly identity formation here in this. I don't read Winnicott as saying something about identity per se, but about potential. About kind of how one is going to be rather than exactly identity. And for Winnicott, it has more to do with these questions of security, which we're going to hear about so much next week from like the best person to possibly do it with us and for us on Bowlby, I'm sure. But I also hear in your question about this idea that the mother is or isn't going to be good enough from their own infancy. And of course, we have to hold out hope that like psychoanalysis would do something for someone. Otherwise, I don't know why we, right, from Winnicott's point of view, we believe in analysis. But he says basically that by the time one is a mother, that's it. You either know or you don't know. And you can't be taught. And he stresses that a lot, and not just in this text. On the other hand, Winnicott was very interested in public pedagogy and teaching mothers. So there is this real contradiction in what he's doing on the BBC Say and what he's saying in his clinical work. So I think that Winnicott does think, and many psychoanalysts would agree, that something special happens in the first 4 months of life, something happens in the first 3 years of life, and things then keep happening, right? But that certain questions around security and insecurity are set, pretty much. I think, yes. How that then shows up in one's mothering, I think it is probably the extrapolation from this paper is what you identify. But we also have to, I'm just repeating myself, I think we have to think that Winnicott would have thought being remothered, i.e. psychoanalysis, right? And we don't, from Freud, have the idea that the analyst is remothering us, right? That comes from the maternalist period, that through the remothering of psychoanalysis, one can be a different kind of mother. And yet Winnicott's pretty clear that by the time you're a mother, it's done. So it doesn't matter if you have an analysis starting 3 weeks into being a mother or something like this, if that's your question about timing. And then with Avgi and Anne's book, I know what you mean in Gender Without Identity, but I do think that it's in a different register. Like, I don't think Winnicott's thinking that way about identity at this moment. But it's an amazing question.
So, let's see what comes next. Okay. Julika, do you want to read out loud, or do you mind if I read it? If you're here, I'll go ahead and read it. In the UK, disallowing immigrant mothers' families from joining them reminds me of using mothers as containers for the state, whilst denying the a priori containment that the children across the border need from their own mothers, leaving the colonized countries in continuing states of infantilization.
Sorry, could I add to that? Sorry, I was a bit slow.
Absolutely, yes, please.
So that wasn't really a question, but further down the chat, I've talked about, I'm interested, Hannah, in knowing your view on intergenerational trauma or strength in the context of Winnicott talking about mothering being this inherent potential, and in the context of past trauma like war and partition, and but as well as current perpetual trauma like racism. How do we then kind of use some of the theories around security and mother-baby development, and kind of add that or superimpose that on kind of social mechanisms of security and unsecurity?
Yeah, thank you so much. And also, I think your comment above is spot on, right? When I said that comment in the chat, I was like, exactly that. I don't, again, this is where I'm very sorry to keep saying I'm not a clinician. It is why I try and stress it at the beginning. So I don't know what you would do to use Winnicott to talk about intergenerational trauma in the clinic, right? But I think that one thing that it's response to also what Guy just put in the chat, what we're seeing here is this real fear of delinquency. It's not the negative outcome is not something about neurosis, right? There's a kind of real kind of damnation that's happening here, and it's kind of like the stakes are so high. As I was looking at my notes and talking to you, every fourth sentence, I didn't read them all because I was trying to spare everyone. And again, the stakes are so high, right? We're constantly having it impressed upon us, and in this way, it's very different from Klein. I think where Klein is like thinking about psychosis the whole time, and it's in a kind of different framework. Here it is much more attached to social welfare. And so I think your own comment is exactly right, which is that these theories are they're not so interested in the kind of subtlety of thinking about intergenerational trauma and how it informs mothering, because it's every mother is an individual with a baby, and every time it's an individual mother baby. We don't get to hear that much about Winnicott's mother, just what she should do and how she changes at the very end, which we didn't look at, but maybe that's where we could start to make an answer for you. Would be in that very last section about the mother herself, right? The changes she undergoes, both physiologically and otherwise. And just the last thing, and there are many, many theories of intergenerational trauma, right? And Winnicott doesn't really, that's not really what's in this, in this piece. It's a much more kind of a slice in time, right? One generation, one dyad.
So we have a question from Max Casey. Given all this talk about what containing means, I was curious what you thought about Bion saying psychoanalysis is not a container, but a probe, and what the significance of probe is in this imaginary.
Well, what did you think, Max, about the probe?
Well, I guess I'm partially unsure now, because I kind of thought container and contained dropped out of the text pretty early. And I felt like Bion was going for this almost like Ivan Illich vibe, like this very anti-institutionalization kind of effort, and seeming to be on the side of the mystic in the way, and arguing that like standardization or scientificization or containerization is, he equivocates here with simplification, vulgarization. And I thought he was trying to kind of put psychoanalysis kind of outside of that, as kind of something without, I don't know, I don't want to say not with a method, but not with any kind of standard containable process. So that's what I thought it meant, I suppose. That's why I was kind of surprised when he started talking about it and started talking about containment. And I thought it was, I don't know, interesting, like a very different reading of the text. So that's why I thought I would ask.
Yeah, I mean, that's there too. Of course, the work on what is the mystic's function, how does the mystic get to function, why are we calling the mystic a mystic and not a genius? Winnicott, I mean, Bion is very careful. It's something I love about him, right? He will give you 3 synonyms, but he's going to choose one, and it has a reason, which is why I was wondering what you thought of the probe. To just go back to your original question, I think he's trying to talk about and differentiate the fact that psychoanalysis is it's a probe, rather than just to do it is to be contained. There's all this work that has to happen in containment. Yes, in language, but not only, right? Same, you know, that's one thing it does share with kind of holding, which is that it's not just the way the mother talks to the baby, right? Or physically holds the baby, but everything else too that she brings with it. So then when we get to all these different kinds of containment, that's what Bion is, he's using the mystic and the group to think about 3 different layers of group containment, right? And I can give them to you again, but it is very much about how groups and institutions, including, right, we have to hear it, the rhyme of the institute to the institution, right? And the, you know, the example he gives for the mystic, of course, is, yes, Jesus Christ, but it's also Sigmund Freud. So psychoanalysis is very much inside rather than outside, right? This, you know, and how did you expect Sigmund Freud to give it to you? And what happens after Sigmund Freud? And so this paper is also troubling this exact moment where, like, Freud is dead. And it has now been some time since Freud is dead, and what is next? So I think all of these things are also there, but here it is through this lens of trying to illustrate container and contained in this section. And it's so much, I'd be happy to just give the forms again that he's using the mystic to think through. Someone just put in the chat a little bit about parasitic containment from Eve, which is where even friendliness is deadly. Samuel, you want to go ahead? I don't know where Wendy went, but I can call on you.
Sure. Well, this is sort of following up on the last point, just thinking about not just about the question of scaling up from the infant to society, but also between the 2 papers. Something that like came up for me was not just thinking about the mystic as this thing that gets contained by an institution, like the healthy institution is able to register change that the mystic brings, just as the good enough mother is able to accommodate the changes in the infant's patterns, but also like the sort of fantasies that then people within the institution have about that authority figure, where it's almost like Freud. I mean, I just think that the roles, they scale a couple of different ways, where one of the uncertainties that one has as a member of a school is what happens when there's a shift that you haven't accounted for with your theory. And then you go back to the master figure, hoping to find somewhere in the texts of that figure, already a prefiguration or prediction of this historical development. You get this with Marx as well, just the sense that it must already be in capital. It must already be somewhere in Freud. So maybe in that sense, that's a fantasy of mothering by the authority figure, rather than usually it's thought of as like a sort of daddy master figure.
I think that's so brilliant. I was gonna say, like, right, this is the people who quote their theory like it's scripture, Marxists, Lacanians, yes, Freudians, but I'm just thinking about quotes, right? Like where there's poets are this way too, right? Through the lineage of lyric poetry, the quote to hand, I have the thing, it's there, that kind of reassurance, that kind of security and insecurity. I think it's really great. I think you should write about it for us, except you're already writing your like 90th essay for, but just really quickly while I have you here, because it's yours is, we have this, you know, beautiful essay right here from Sam. So you should definitely find it online. Yeah,
Maybe one day in the future.
yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think that's right. And we've been seeing that discursively a lot right now. What is it to be a Marxist, for instance? Is there a family inherited potential, right? Is there a temperament? And I think Bion is interested in all of those elements, right? Not just the theory, not just, but like what the mystic is allowed to do, what it can give. Yeah, mothering. I think that's really nice. I think it's really, really nice. And yes, sorry, there's so many questions now.
Yeah. Let's see.
And how are we
So
doing on time when?
we're doing good. Yeah, I think we can go a bit longer. Ariel, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it? I'll just assume if I don't hear.
I can ask it.
Okay, great.
Although I'm saying maybe I wrote it more articulately than I can sum it up right now. But like, you know, one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot in this discussion right now is Milton's play Samson Agonistes, in which like the problem of like revelation is like an immediately like political and personal problem. When you have all these like revelations that are supposedly coming from God that are like, you know, oh, I have to break the law like in this way or another way. And this seems like it's kind of this ongoing, immediate historical, political, cultural problem kind of in Christianity, also in Judaism, just because what we just talked about, right? That like at some point, you know, avenues for revelation either entirely closed or like greatly attenuated. So there's this question of like, there's not just like this idea of like political containment of, you know, an emerging ideology, but there's like the political containment of the person that like has this revelation that like needs to square or it's a rupture and it's not valid or along those lines. So like thinking about that, I'm kind of like very curious about how this conversation aligns with the like what makes for an appropriate realization that someone has like during the process of analysis. Because it like has to be like it has to be like, it has to have a certain kind of provenance and like shape and structure and can't be like too determined by the analyst, right? There are like these like interesting parameters about like that moment that are also kind of judged after the fact. So I'm curious about the alignment of these two things, like from this like broader, like this, you know, broad political discussion to like how this kind of assessment of like where something is coming from is operating in like the clinical encounter.
Yeah, okay, great. For the Milton part, I'm totally gonna ask Wendy to tag in because
Not a Miltonist. Can't.
yeah, but at least
help.
at least we can put it in your field. I know I'm not a Miltonist, you know what I mean? And then in terms of the kind of validity of interpretation or realization or kind of that's really interesting to think about with container contained. And then how to scale it, right? And the way that, you know, I think it's something that Bion does here. He does it in other papers that are trying to advance this thinking about contained and contained. There is this very quick scaling where it has some of the most one-to-one correspondences, like the way the mother contains that action, also the analyst, in part through projective identification, right? But Wendy, do you want to try Milton?
I really apologize. I can't. But I
We
appreciate
have
the
a Miltonist.
conversation. I
Hey,
know.
wait, wasn't we have someone, wait, but we have someone who works on Milton in the seminar, but I don't know if she's actually in the room. I'm not seeing her. She was here earlier. Okay, next week I'm going to put you two in a direct chat or whatever, because we do actually have our own Miltonist in the seminar.
Always good to have an in-house Miltonist.
Always.
Yeah. And there was a question that Soren posed a while ago that came back, which I think is very interesting. Can we touch on his discussion of language a bit? Bion's. Sorry, Soren, do you want to ask a question, or is it okay? Bye. Okay. The way I read Bion is that this is scaled as well. Language is a primary function of containment the mother imbues in the infant, and also integral to the role of state containment.
Soren, do you want to say a little bit more, either in the chat or out loud, or pull a quote from Bion so we can all get there and all get on the same page?
So let's see. The paragraph is, it is essential that the language should be preserved. To this end, rules are produced under which words and definitions are to be used. The Oxford Dictionary, linguistic philosophy, mathematical logic are tributes to the work that is incessantly proceeding for this purpose. It goes on from there, but that's the point that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah. So what are you making? I mean, I love this, and what I make up about it is that this is Bion really flexing, and he's giving us a theory of language in the rule, and yes, state. So I think you're spot on. I think it's also to say why he's going to start working with these new terms, right? He's starting to introduce the symbols instead of words. So the male and female symbols are going to follow right after this, around not pinning down. So in fact, the opposite, like not wanting to put something into language, not wanting to put something into words, as well. And so like the part that in order to even give us a theory of containment requires a not pinning downness. And that's also what's going to happen towards the end with O, which I tried to signal really briefly, but O gets elaborated elsewhere. It's not here. So it's like we can barely talk about it. But I feel like Bion's having fun is the other thing that's happening here. Like there's a lot of fun being had in this writing. When he says that the master, the head of the group, whose reputation sinks like a stone, this is part, I feel like he's on one here. So thanks to Faraday and other scientists, ordinary people can illuminate a room by a touch of the switch. Thanks to Freud and his coworkers. I mean, this is like, that's funny, I think, is also part of what's happening here. But he's also sort of saying, I want to keep away from the pinning down, which is part of also what containment is. We can see that in the bad forms of containment too. The over pinning down is not giving it back to someone in the form they can use it when it gets too static. Maybe that also picks up from Ariel's comment about realization and interpretation and its landing. Yeah. I don't know if that helps. And we can also certainly talk about it together.
If anyone else has any closing questions or comments you want to add, feel free to raise your hand. I think we mostly made our way through the chat, although our next session next week will pick up on these same ideas, so we'll be able to continue this conversation. And the Bowlby text should be added now to the drive.
It
And
came in last night.
yeah,
And we'll add the chat, like we've been
Yes.
saving the chat. And just
Yes.
again, in case you came in a little late, Wendy already said, we have a YouTube channel, and that's where videos where the speaker approves go. And when the speaker doesn't approve it, they go into the Dropbox, meaning if the person's allowed it to be recorded for internal use. So those are the two places to check. So Fockery's is already live and online on YouTube. I'm going to drop it in the chat if part of what you want to do is be watching them all together.
Great. Thank
Ready
you
to-
so much, Hannah. That was fantastic. Really helpful. And you'll be writing on this hopefully at some point. So watch out for that. Thank you everyone so much for coming and for your comments and questions. It was really generative. So join us next week, same time. We'll send out an email and we'll be talking more about attachment through Bowlby. And definitely, if you're interested, we have the third issue available now on our website, and some of the articles are already available online. So we hope you enjoy them, and thank you so much.
Including from Miltonist Katie Cadu. So, you know, if you
Yes.
get your Milton fix somehow, you can. Thank you, everyone, and see you next week.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.